The evening was alive with shimmering lights that spilled across the marble floors of the city's grandest hotel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like frozen fireworks above the ballroom, and the gentle hum of violins floated through the air. The guests, draped in gowns stitched with silver threads and tuxedos sharper than knives, moved about with practiced elegance. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between the tables, offering champagne that glowed golden under the light. The atmosphere was thick with wealth and status, the kind of place where every detail whispered luxury. Among the many celebrated figures in attendance was Victor Legrand, a man whose name alone carried the weight of admiration and envy alike. He was known across continents as a brilliant pianist, one who could make an audience weep or cheer with nothing but the movement of his fingers. His concerts were sold out months in advance, and critics hailed him as a genius of modern classical music. Yet beneath the brilliance was a man many quietly resented, for his pride was as towering as his talent. Victor did not merely play the piano, he owned every room he entered, demanding attention with his presence. Victor stood near the stage that evening, surrounded by a cluster of admirers. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, his posture straight, his chin raised ever so slightly, as if to remind the world he belonged above it. Guests leaned closer, eager to catch his words, to laugh at his sharp wit, and perhaps to be remembered by him later. For Victor, such gatherings were less about music and more about showcasing himself. He basked in admiration, letting it feed his already swelling ego. At the far end of the ballroom, away from the glitter and laughter, Clara moved quietly among the guests with a silver tray in her hands. She was one of the many waitresses hired to serve drinks and appetizers. Her black and white uniform was neat but simple, blending into the background so that the focus remained on the glamorous guests. Clara's eyes, however, told a different story. They sparkled with curiosity as they moved from the golden decorations to the grand piano resting at the center of the room. The polished surface reflected the lights like a mirror, and Clara felt her heart stir every time she passed by it. For her, the piano was not just a decoration, but a dream she had carried since childhood. Clara had grown up in a modest neighborhood, where music was her secret escape. Her family could never afford lessons or expensive instruments, but she had discovered an old keyboard at a second-hand shop and saved every coin she could to buy it. The keys were worn and sometimes stuck, yet she loved it more than anything. Night after night, she would sit in her small room and teach herself melodies, copying from songs she heard on the radio or pieces she found online. The piano was her silent friend, her comfort in difficult times, though her world tonight was filled with the clink of glasses and the chatter of wealthy strangers. Her heart beat in rhythm with the grand piano that waited patiently at the front of the ballroom. The contrast between Clara and Victor could not have been sharper. He stood in the spotlight adored and envied, while she lingered in the shadows unnoticed. Yet fate had woven their paths together in that one evening. Clara had no desire to be seen, no plan to prove herself. She only wanted to finish her work with grace, to keep her balance as she moved swiftly between the sea of gowns and tuxedos. Still deep inside, the music within her longed for a chance, a small moment when she could touch the ivory keys of the piano and let her soul speak. The chatter of the ballroom grew louder as the night unfolded. Waiters rushed to refill glasses, laughter rang out in bursts, and the violinists played with a practiced calm. The anticipation of Victor's performance floated in the air like perfume. Everyone knew he would soon take his place at the piano, and once again remind the world why he was celebrated as a prodigy. Clara could feel the excitement even though she tried to keep her focus on her duties. She stole one last glance at the piano, unaware that before the night ended, it would be her hands, not Victor's, that would leave the audience breathless. Clara's life outside the golden walls of the hotel was a world apart from the glittering ballrooms she worked in. Her small apartment sat above a bakery on a noisy street where the smell of fresh bread greeted her every morning. The place was cramped, the paint on the walls was peeling, and the pipes rattled when the water ran. But it was home. She had decorated it with hand-me-down furniture and tiny personal touches. Like pressed flowers she kept between old books and a worn blanket her grandmother had knitted years ago. It wasn't luxury, but it was filled with pieces of love. Her daily routine was demanding. She worked double shifts at different catering jobs, sometimes barely sleeping before heading off to her next shift. On most nights, she dragged herself home with aching feet and tired arms. But even then, before she allowed sleep to take her, she would sit in front of her battered second-hand keyboard, Her fingers would hover over the keys, and as soon as they pressed down, the exhaustion seemed to melt away. She played not for an audience, not for recognition, but because music was her way of breathing. Clara's passion for the piano started when she was a child. She remembered the first time she heard a pianist play live. It was at a community event, where an old upright piano had been rolled onto a stage in the park. The man who played was not famous nor dressed in fine clothes, but to young Clara he seemed like magic. His fingers told stories that words could not. The sound wrapped around her like a blanket and stirred something inside her heart. From that day, she dreamed of becoming someone who could speak through music. But reality had never been gentle to her dreams. Her parents worked long hours in modest jobs and could not afford private lessons. When Clara begged for a piano, her mother had smiled sadly and shook her head, explaining gently that love did not always buy everything. Clara didn't cry. Instead, she decided she would teach herself with whatever she could find. She saved coins she earned from helping neighbors. And after many months, she bought the old, slightly broken keyboard from a dusty thrift shop. The keys were yellowed and the sound sometimes buzzed. But to Clara it was more precious than gold. Her evenings became her secret concerts. She would listen to classical pieces on a borrowed CD player, and then try to copy them on her little keyboard. Mistakes were plenty, but each wrong note taught her something new. When her neighbors complained about the sound, she learned to play softly, carefully pressing the keys with control. Over the years, her skill grew quietly in the shadows. She had no teacher, no audience, but she had determination. Music was not the only challenge in her life. Clara was also balancing college studies. She dreamed of becoming a teacher one day, someone who could inspire others the way music had inspired her. But tuition fees were heavy, and part-time jobs barely covered the bills. She juggled lectures, assignments, and late-night catering shifts with the grace of someone who knew she had no other choice. Her resilience was her strength, yet it also weighed on her. There were nights she stared at her textbooks, eyes blurred with fatigue, wondering if she was chasing too many impossible things at once. Still, Clara never allowed bitterness to grow. She found joy in small things. A good book borrowed from the library, the smell of rain on warm pavement, the laughter of children in the park near her apartment. She believed that beauty was everywhere if one looked closely enough. Her music, in many ways, was a reflection of this belief. Even when her life felt hard, her melodies carried hope, and yet, inside her lived a secret wish. She wanted just once to play a real piano, not the cracked keyboard that hummed and clicked under her touch. A grand piano like the ones she saw in magazines, glossy and proud, whose keys shone like pearls and whose sound filled an entire hall. She wanted to know what it felt like for her fingers to dance across such an instrument, to let her emotions echo in a space where people actually listened. She never spoke this dream aloud, not even to her closest friends. It was too fragile, too personal. She carried it quietly in her heart, like a candle she didn't want the wind to see. That was why the Grand Hotel ballroom held such a strange magic for her. While others admired the chandeliers or the golden decorations, Clara's eyes always found the piano. It sat there like a king among instruments, polished and perfect, waiting to be played. Whenever she passed it while carrying her tray, she slowed her steps just enough to catch a glimpse. The reflection of the lights on its surface almost seemed to wink at her, reminding her of everything she longed for but did not yet have. For Clara, working in places like this was a strange mixture of pain and inspiration. She was surrounded by people who lived lives she could only imagine, yet she also stood close to the very world she dreamed of entering. It was as if fate had placed her near the edge of the stage, waiting to see whether she would remain a silent observer or one day step into the light. What Clara didn't know that night was how quickly things could change. Dreams she had carried silently for years, dreams she thought belonged only to her bedroom and her second-hand keyboard, were about to be dragged into the dazzling light of the ballroom. The path between shadows and spotlight was closer than she ever believed, and the luxury ball would become the place where her quiet passion finally spoke louder than anyone's laughter. The night had been flowing smoothly, crystal glasses clinked, and laughter rolled through the golden hall like waves. The orchestra played softly in the background, their strings weaving delicate music that seemed to make the chandelier sparkle brighter. Clara moved among the guests with practiced grace, balancing a tray of champagne flutes, her eyes always alert to avoid any missteps. She had almost reached the far side of the ballroom when fate decided to test her courage. Victor Legrand, the celebrated pianist, stood surrounded by a circle of admirers. His voice carried above the chatter, polished and commanding. He gestured elegantly with one hand while holding his glass in the other. Every movement seemed rehearsed as though he were still on stage. The guest near him hung on his every word, laughing when he allowed, nodding when he spoke of music and culture. Clara, careful as ever, approached their group to refill the drinks. Her hands were steady, her steps light. But the ballroom was crowded. A guest brushed past unexpectedly, causing her to shift her balance. In that instant, a few golden drops of champagne leapt from the glass and landed on Victor's immaculate black sleeve. The room seemed to pause as though time itself held its breath. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She immediately reached for her napkin, whispering a quick apology. But the silence had already cracked open into something sharper. Victor turned slowly, his expression hardening. He looked down at his sleeve as if the small droplets were an unforgivable insult. Then he lifted his gaze to Clara. His eyes cold and sharp, his voice rang out clearly, slicing through the air. "Do you not know how to serve properly?" he asked, his tone heavy with disdain. Laughter flickered among the crowd. Not because the mistake was funny, but because Victor had spoken and they felt obliged to react. Clara's cheeks burned. She bowed her head slightly. Murmuring another apology, she wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and hide. But Victor was not finished. He raised his sleeve for everyone to see and continued. "This is why some people belong in the background," he said. "A luxury ball is no place for clumsy hands," his words, dripping with arrogance, were meant not just for her but for everyone listening. It was a performance as much as his music, only this one used cruelty as its instrument. The laughter grew louder this time. Though not everyone joined in, some shifted uncomfortably. Glancing at Clara with pity, others smirked. Entertained by Victor's cruelty, Clara stood frozen. Clutching her tray, her throat tight, she wanted to defend herself, to explain. But her voice refused to rise. Instead, she lowered her eyes and stepped back. Her dignity trembled, but she held it together, moving away quickly to continue her work. Inside, however, her emotions churned like a storm. Every word Victor had spoken echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than the spilled champagne ever could. She had worked tirelessly to support herself, to study, to play music whenever she could, and yet in front of these strangers, she had been reduced to nothing more than a joke. She bit her lip, forcing back tears. She would not let them see her break, not here, not now. The guests around Victor returned to their conversations, the incident already fading into their evening of entertainment. For them, it was a moment of amusement, something to forget by the time dessert was served. But for Clara, it was a wound that stung with every step she took. She kept moving, tray in hand, smile painted across her face though her heart ached. That smile was her shield, and she wore it because she knew in her world, weakness was not allowed. Yet hidden beneath her humiliation was a spark. Victor's ridicule had planted something inside her, something fierce and unshakable. Clara had always kept her dreams tucked quietly within herself, content to remain invisible, but now, his words made her want to prove him wrong, not with anger or revenge, but with the very gift he thought she did not have the right to touch. Her fingers longed to play. Her heart longed to speak through music, and for the first time, she wondered what would happen if she dared. The grand piano stood silently at the front of the room, gleaming under the chandeliers, waiting. Clara glanced at it whenever she passed, her steps slowing. Her reflection flashed briefly on its polished surface, and in her heart she whispered a promise. She would not let his cruelty define her. She had no idea how or when, but she felt it. A chance would come, and when it did, she would show them all that the girl carrying trays was more than a shadow. Victor, meanwhile, basked in his moment of superiority. He sipped his champagne, the stain on his sleeve long forgotten. His fans chuckled at his remarks, offering him admiration as though he had just performed a dazzling sonata. He relished their attention, blind to the quiet storm he had awakened in the girl he had humiliated. To him, the incident was nothing, a flicker in a night filled with applause. To Clara, it was everything, the spark that would change the course of her life. What no one in that glittering ballroom knew was that before the night ended, the balance would shift. The famous pianist who laughed at the waitress would soon be silenced, not by force, not by anger, but by the power of music itself. The piano that had stood quietly like a secret guardian would open its voice to Clara, and through her it would speak louder than mockery, louder than pride, and louder than every cruel laugh that had tried to break her spirit. The ballroom carried on with its rhythm. Glasses clinked, Music swelled from the orchestra, and guests whispered about business, art, and wealth to everyone else. The incident with Clara was forgotten, swept away in the tide of luxury. But inside Clara, the words still burned. They clung to her like shadows, replaying in her mind with every step she took. She held her tray firmly, her back straight. Determined not to let anyone see the storm within her, Victor moved toward the piano, his admirers following him like moths chasing light. The air shifted as whispers spread across the room. "It's time for him to play," someone said. Heads turned, conversations paused, and even the orchestra silenced itself. The grand piano stood at the center of it all, waiting like a throne for its king. Victor adjusted his cufflinks with exaggerated elegance. Drawing out the moment, he loved this anticipation. The way hundreds of eyes watched him, he thrived on it. Clara, though busy, couldn't help but watch from the corner of the room. Her heart pounded as she saw him take his seat. The same man who had reduced her to nothing minutes ago was now being celebrated. She bit her lip, swallowing her frustration. Her gaze drifted again to the polished keys of the piano, imagining for just a second what it would feel like to sit there, to play something so powerful that no one would dare laugh. She shook the thought away, reminding herself she was a waitress, not a star, but fate loves irony. Just as Victor placed his fingers on the keys, a stir went through the hall. The stage manager whispered something urgently to the host. The lights dimmed slightly, but there was confusion. Victor frowned, tapping the piano with annoyance. The problem was small but enough to delay him. His sheet music had not been delivered correctly. The staff scrambled, running in and out, trying to fix the situation. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Murmuring at the interruption, a silence stretched across the room. Thick and heavy, without music, the glamour of the evening felt strangely fragile. Guests coughed, glasses clinked too loudly, and Victor's face darkened with impatience. He hated waiting, hated anything that disrupted his perfect performance. The host tried to calm the audience with a few polite words, but the restlessness only grew in the middle of it all. Clara's eyes once again found the piano. It seemed to be calling her, daring her. Her chest tightened as an idea formed. Wild and unthinkable. What if she stepped forward? What if she filled the silence? The thought terrified her, but it also thrilled her. Her heart raced faster than ever. Her hands, still holding the tray, trembled. It was madness, she told herself. But she could not push the idea away. She had spent years hiding her music, playing only for herself tonight. Surrounded by laughter and humiliation, her heart demanded something more. She looked around. Every guest was focused on Victor, waiting, growing restless. The host glanced nervously at the stage. Hoping the delay would end, Clara felt invisible, as though no one noticed her. That invisibility was a shield, and within it she found courage. Slowly, carefully, she placed her tray down on a nearby table. Her breathing quickened, her palms grew damp, but her feet began to move. Each step toward the stage felt heavier than the last, yet also freer. When she reached the front, she hesitated. The lights glowed brighter here, and she could feel the weight of the crowd behind her. The piano loomed before her, more magnificent than she had ever imagined. Its keys gleamed like pearls, its body polished to perfection. For a moment, doubt gripped her. What if she failed? What if they laughed even louder? But then she remembered Victor's sneer, his cruel words, and something inside her snapped. Clara turned to the host, her voice soft but steady. "May I play something just while we wait?" she asked. The host blinked in surprise. Unsure how to respond, a few nearby guests chuckled, whispering to each other. A waitress playing the piano. How absurd. Yet in the silence that stretched across the room, the host saw the desperation to fill the emptiness and finally nodded. "Very well," he said reluctantly. Stepping aside, Victor scoffed, leaning back in his chair. His lips curled in a smirk, amused at her audacity. "This should be interesting," he murmured loudly enough for people to hear. Laughter rippled again, but Clara no longer cared. She walked to the piano, her legs trembling but her heart steady. She lowered herself onto the bench, the air around her suddenly thick with expectation. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keys. Her entire life, every lonely night, every mistake, every secret practice led her to this very moment. The ballroom waited, skeptical, amused, restless. Some leaned forward, ready to laugh if she stumbled. Others crossed their arms, expecting nothing more than noise. But Clara closed her eyes, blocking them all out. She felt the piano beneath her fingertips, Powerful and alive, she pressed the first note, and the sound rang out, pure and deep, cutting through the air like a clear voice in the dark. The laughter faded, replaced by silence. Her fingers moved again, then again, and soon they danced across the keys with confidence. The melody rose, delicate and strong, filled with emotion. It was not the music of a clumsy waitress, it was the music of someone who had lived, someone who had dreamed, and someone who had dared. Victor's smirk vanished, his eyes narrowed as the sound filled the hall. Guests leaned in, captivated, whispers stopped, and the restless shifting of feet ceased. The room belonged to her now. Clara's music swelled, weaving sorrow, hope, and triumph into every note. She was no longer invisible, no longer silent. She was a voice the entire ballroom had to hear. The first notes Clara played shimmered through the ballroom like a thread of light, soft and uncertain at first, but with every passing second her touch grew stronger. Her fingers, slender and steady, moved across the keys as though the piano had been waiting for her all along. Each sound echoed with feeling, and each chord carried a piece of her soul. The room, once buzzing with restless chatter, began to quiet slowly, like waves retreating from the shore. Guests turned their heads, curious at first, then surprised. A waitress playing the grand piano was unexpected, almost laughable. Yet as the music spread, their skepticism began to fade. The melody was not clumsy, nor timid. It was alive, full of emotion. The notes rose and fell like a story being told without words. Every ear leaned closer. Every heart felt something stir. Clara's eyes closed as she lost herself in the music. She no longer saw the chandeliers or the glittering gowns. She no longer heard the soft coughs or the clinking glasses. All that existed was the piano, her hands, and the sound flowing between them. She played with the fire of someone who had long been silent, someone who had waited years for this one chance to be heard. Her soul poured through her fingertips, painting pictures that words could never capture. Victor, sitting nearby, felt his chest tighten. At first he smirked, expecting her to stumble. But as the melody grew stronger, the smirk slipped away. His sharp eyes followed every movement of her fingers, disbelief creeping into his proud face. How could a simple waitress, someone beneath his notice, command the piano with such skill, such passion, such mastery? The laughter he had enjoyed earlier seemed to mock him now. The crowd, too, was swept away. Couples who had been whispering about business or gossip now sat still. Eyes wide, a woman dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A man pressed a hand against his chest as if steadying his heartbeat. The music wrapped around them all, binding them together in silence. Clara's playing was not perfect by technical standards, but it was raw, it was real, and it reached places in the heart that perfection never could. Her fingers flew faster now, the keys responding as if they had known her forever. She played as though she had lived 1,000 lives in preparation for this moment. Every lesson learned on her broken keyboard at home, every mistake, every tear, every secret night of practice. It was all there, woven into her song. The piano did not resist her, it embraced her, giving her sound the fullness she had always dreamed of. Her music rose like a tide, unstoppable, undeniable. Whispers rippled through the audience. But they were no longer mocking. They were filled with awe. People leaned forward in their chairs, eyes shining. The silence was no longer heavy with impatience, it was reverent, fragile, like glass that could shatter if someone dared to breathe too loudly. Even the waiters paused at the edges of the room, holding their trays mid-air, forgetting their duties as they watched one of their own transform before their eyes. Clara opened her eyes briefly and caught sight of her reflection on the piano's glossy surface. She barely recognized herself. She was not the invisible girl carrying trays anymore, not the one mocked for clumsiness. In this moment she was the music. And the music was her. Her confidence surged, and she struck the keys with even greater force, sending the melody soaring higher. Victor's fists tightened on his knees. His pride burned like fire. For years he had been the one everyone admired, the one who silenced rooms with his genius. Yet here he was, overshadowed by someone he had ridiculed only minutes ago. The humiliation stung worse than any spilled champagne. His jaw clenched, but he could not look away. He was trapped in her performance, just like everyone else. The climax of her piece built like a storm. The notes grew louder, fuller, filling every corner of the ballroom. It was a sound that demanded attention, demanded respect. Clara poured everything into it, her hardships, her dreams, her humiliation, her hope. She played not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they did not belong. Every note was her defiance, her answer, her triumph, and then, with a final rush, her fingers struck the last chord. The sound lingered in the air like the echo of thunder after lightning. Then silence fell. A silence so complete it was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Clara sat frozen, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths, her hands trembling above the keys. For a moment she feared it had not been enough, that they would laugh again. But then a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow and steady, others joined, faster, stronger, until the entire ballroom erupted into applause. The walls shook with it, the chandeliers trembled with it. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even shouting her name, though they had only just learned it. Clara's eyes widened, her heart racing. She had never imagined such a response, never imagined that her hidden passion could command such a storm of admiration. Victor sat still, his face pale, his applause absent. His defeat was not in words, but in silence. He had been undone not by anger, not by confrontation, but by music itself. The very language he thought he owned had been spoken more purely, more powerfully, by the girl he had humiliated, and nothing he could say or do would change it. Clara rose slowly from the bench, her knees weak. She bowed slightly, her hair falling across her face. The applause washed over her like a wave, overwhelming and beautiful. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. She was seen, she was heard, and she was unforgettable. The thunder of applause echoed through the ballroom. Refusing to fade, guests clapped until their palms stung. Some even shouted, "Bravo," while others whistled with admiration. The chandeliers swayed slightly as though they too were celebrating. Clara stood beside the piano, trembling, her chest rising and falling with every shaky breath. She bowed once more, her eyes glistening with tears she tried to hold back. This was not just applause for a performance, it was recognition, something she had dreamed of but never dared to expect. She looked out across the crowd and saw faces transformed. The same people who had laughed when Victor mocked her were now standing, their hands raised in ovation. Their eyes held no trace of ridicule now, only awe and respect. A woman in pearls pressed her hands together as though she had just witnessed a miracle. A man with silver hair wiped his eyes quickly. Pretending he was not moved, the atmosphere had shifted. Clara was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the star of the evening. Victor sat stiffly at his chair, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. He could not bring himself to join in the applause. His pride screamed inside him, demanding he rise and reclaim his place. But the truth was undeniable. In the space of a few minutes, Clara had accomplished what he feared most. She had taken the stage without permission and conquered it. The silence he offered was more noticeable than any clapping. His bitterness clung to him like a shadow. Some guests noticed Victor's refusal to applaud, and their admiration for Clara deepened. To them, his silence only revealed his arrogance, while her courage spoke louder than any critique he could ever make. They turned their backs on him, choosing instead to cheer for the girl who had transformed humiliation into triumph. Clara did not gloat, she did not even look at Victor. Her gaze was soft, humble, almost shy. She seemed surprised by her own strength. The host hurried forward, his face flushed with both relief and excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice above the clapping, "what a remarkable performance we have just witnessed." His words only encouraged the audience to cheer louder. He turned to Clara, bowing slightly in respect. "Miss, may I ask your name?" Clara hesitated, her voice trembling but clear as she answered, "Clara." The room repeated her name like an echo. "Clara, Clara," as though branding it into memory. In the crowd, a man wearing spectacles leaned toward his wife. He was a professor at the conservatory, a respected figure in the world of music. His eyes gleamed as he whispered, "That girl has something rare, pure talent, raw and untamed." His wife nodded, equally moved. They exchanged a glance that carried an unspoken decision. This night was only the beginning for Clara. They would not let her gift fade back into the shadows. Meanwhile, Clara's co-workers, the other waiters and waitresses, stood frozen near the walls. They stared at her as though they were seeing her for the first time. Pride filled their hearts, for one of their own had dared to step into the light and shine brighter than all the chandeliers combined. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Others whispered excitedly about how they would never forget this night. Clara, who had once blended into the background, had become unforgettable. The music still lingered in the air. Even though the piano had fallen silent, it clung to the hearts of the guests. Echoing in their minds, no one rushed to speak. As though they feared breaking the fragile spell she had cast, Clara herself felt dazed. She could hardly believe she had done it. She wanted to pinch herself to ask if this was a dream. But the roaring applause told her it was real. Her secret had been revealed to the world, and the world had embraced it. Victor finally rose from his chair, his face pale. He walked toward the piano with stiff movements. His lips pressed into a thin line. He stood beside Clara, the spotlight touching them both. But the energy of the room belonged entirely to her. "Impressive," he muttered, his voice low, loud enough only for her to hear. It was not praise. It was resentment wrapped in politeness. Clara glanced at him briefly, her eyes calm. She did not need his approval anymore. The applause of hundreds was louder than his pride. The host gestured toward Victor, hoping to continue the program. But the audience had no patience for him now. Their attention remained fixed on Clara. Guests crowded forward, some reaching out to shake her hand, others showering her with words of admiration. "Where did you learn to play?" one asked. "You must have studied at the finest schools," another guessed. Clara only smiled, shaking her head gently. She did not explain, she let the mystery remain. For the truth was even more powerful. She had taught herself through struggle and perseverance. As the applause finally began to fade, a new sound filled the hall. Softer but filled with promise, conversations rose again. But this time Clara's name floated among them like music. "Clara, the waitress," they whispered. "No, Clara the pianist," others corrected. She had stepped out of her shadow and into a light that no ridicule could dim. Clara returned to her place quietly, her heart racing. Her co-workers surrounded her with smiles and whispers of pride. She felt both overwhelmed and at peace. The girl who had walked into the ballroom carrying a tray of glasses was not the same girl now. Something inside her had shifted. She knew it, and so did everyone else. Victor sat back at the piano at last, but when his fingers touched the keys, the magic was gone. The audience listened politely, but their hearts remained with Clara. His performance, though technically perfect, felt hollow. Like a painting without color, he played, but he no longer owned the room. Clara had taken that away with nothing more than truth and courage. When the echoes of the applause finally faded, the ballroom no longer felt the same. The air that had once been heavy with wealth and arrogance now hummed with something softer, something filled with wonder. Clara stood still, her heart still racing, her fingers tingling from the power of the music that had just poured out of her. She looked around the hall and realized that every pair of eyes was still on her. Not with ridicule, but with respect. Guests began to step forward, their gowns sweeping across the polished floor. A man with silver hair, whose face she recognized from newspapers, approached her with a warm smile. He introduced himself as a professor of music at the city's most prestigious conservatory. "Young lady," he said gently, "what you did tonight was extraordinary." His words made her breath catch. She wanted to answer, but her voice refused. So she simply nodded, her eyes wide. The professor continued, "Talent like yours should not be hidden. It should be nurtured, shared, celebrated. Would you consider studying under me?" Clara's heart nearly stopped. For years she had taught herself on a broken keyboard, and now one of the finest teachers in the country was offering her a chance. Other guests surrounded her, showering her with questions and praise. "Where did you train?" one woman asked. "You play with such feeling," another added. Clara answered humbly, never revealing the struggles behind her journey. She smiled softly. Knowing the truth made her music even more special. Some offered her business cards, some offered connections. A man even suggested helping her record her first piece someday. The world that had always seemed locked away from her was suddenly opening, door by door. Her coworkers gathered near the walls, whispering excitedly. They looked at her with pride, almost disbelief. Clara, the girl who carried trays beside them, had just stunned the wealthiest people in the city. One of her fellow waitresses squeezed her hand tightly and whispered, "You showed them who you really are." Clara's eyes filled with tears at those words. For once, she was not defined by her uniform, not defined by her background. She was defined by her gift. Victor, meanwhile, remained seated at the piano, his performance finished but forgotten. His silence screamed louder than any insult he could have spoken. The crowd barely noticed him now, and those who did only glanced at him with pity or disdain. Clara had not intended to embarrass him, but the truth had a way of shining brighter than pride. He slipped away quietly, leaving the hall without the triumphant applause he was used to. His shadow no longer stretched across the room. As the night drew on, Clara returned to her duties, though the tray felt lighter in her hands. Every guest she passed looked at her differently. Some nodded respectfully, others smiled warmly. Even those who had laughed earlier now lowered their eyes in shame. She did not hold grudges. She continued to serve with grace, but inside she carried a quiet joy. She knew that her life had shifted, even if only slightly. The path ahead was no longer the same. Later, when the guests began to leave, the professor found her again. He handed her a card with his number. "Call me tomorrow," he said firmly. "I will make the arrangements. You must study, you must play. It is your calling." Clara took the card carefully. Her hands trembling, she whispered a thank you, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. She knew she could never let this opportunity slip away. When the ballroom finally emptied, Clara stood alone for a moment, staring at the grand piano. The lights reflected across its polished surface, and for the first time, she allowed herself to touch it one last time that evening. Her fingers brushed the keys gently, as though saying goodbye or perhaps promising to return. A smile spread across her face. She had been invisible when she arrived, but she would not leave the same. Walking home later that night, the city felt different too. The streets buzzed with their usual noise. Cars honking, people hurrying, but Clara's world glowed brighter. The card in her pocket was a weight she cherished, a doorway to the dream she had always carried. She looked up at the stars, and for the first time in a long while, she felt they were looking back at her, nodding, encouraging. She reached her small apartment above the bakery and unlocked the door. Inside, the familiar scent of bread lingered. Her old keyboard sat in the corner, worn and yellowed. She walked to it slowly, running her fingers across the keys. The sound was faint and broken compared to the grand piano, but her heart swelled with love for it. This little keyboard had been her teacher, her friend, her only stage for so many years. She whispered softly, "We did it," as though the keys could hear. That night she lay awake in bed, replaying everything: Victor's ridicule, the silence before she played, the storm of applause, and the professor's offer. It felt unreal, like a dream she feared might vanish with the sunrise. But when she touched the card again, she knew it was real. Her life had cracked open, and the light of possibility was pouring through. She did not know what the future would hold, but she knew she would no longer hide her music. In her heart, she carried a promise to herself. She would work harder, study fiercely, and seize every opportunity. No longer would she play only in secret. No longer would her music be confined to a small room above a bakery. The world had heard her, and the world had listened. Clara knew this was only the beginning of a journey she had always dreamed of. A journey that started with humiliation but ended with triumph. A journey that turned a waitress into a pianist, a shadow into a star. The night of the luxury ball became a story whispered across the city. It was retold not as an evening of fine wine or sparkling gowns, but as the night when a waitress silenced the proud with nothing more than her music. People spoke of Clara with wonder, remembering how she had walked to the piano with trembling steps and left it as someone transformed. For some it was entertainment, for others inspiration, but for Clara, it was life itself. In the days that followed, Clara returned to her modest routine. She still woke early, still worked long hours, still studied late into the night. Yet something had shifted in her. She no longer carried her tray with the quiet invisibility she once did. She moved with a quiet dignity, knowing she had shown the world a glimpse of her soul. The memory of the applause lingered in her heart like a secret flame, reminding her that she was capable of more than survival. The professor who had approached her kept his word. He arranged for Clara to visit the conservatory, to meet other musicians, to explore opportunities she had never dared imagine. For the first time in her life, she touched sheet music not borrowed from the internet, but placed into her hands by a teacher who believed in her. The dream she had kept hidden in her small apartment had begun to grow roots in the world outside, and Clara knew she would never again let it wither in silence. Yet even as doors opened, Clara remained humble. She did not forget the bakery-scented apartment where her broken keyboard waited. She did not forget the long nights of exhaustion, the calluses on her fingers, the moments of doubt. Instead, she carried them with her, weaving them into her music. Every note she played was a story of perseverance, a story of hope, a story of a girl who had been laughed at but refused to let laughter define her. Victor, on the other hand, became a shadow of his former glory. The ball had not ended the career he had built, but it had left a scar. People remembered his arrogance that night as much as his talent. The contrast was too sharp. Clara's humility had made his pride appear uglier than ever. He continued to play, continued to fill concert halls, but whispers followed him wherever he went. The story of the waitress who silenced him clung to him like an echo he could not escape. For Clara, the reflection was different. She did not dwell on Victor or his cruelty. She thought instead about what the piano had given her: the chance to be seen, the chance to be heard, the chance to turn pain into beauty. She realized that music was more than talent, more than technique. It was truth. It was the voice of the soul, and the soul had no rank, no wealth, no uniform. Anyone who carried music inside them had the right to let it be heard. Clara often returned to that moment in her mind: the silence before her first note, the way the crowd had waited for her to fail. She remembered the fear in her chest, the trembling of her hands, yet she also remembered how the music rose above it all, carrying her, lifting her, teaching her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving despite it. That lesson became her guide, not only in music but in life. As weeks turned to months, Clara began performing in small halls, invited by those who had been present at the ball. The audiences were never as grand as that first night, but she played with the same passion every time. Her music touched people because it was real, born from struggle and sincerity. She never pretended to be someone she was not, and perhaps that was why her songs reached deeper than polished perfection ever could. In her quiet moments, Clara would sit at her old keyboard. Still faithful in its imperfections, she would smile as her fingers touched its worn keys, remembering how far she had come to her. It was not a relic of poverty but a symbol of resilience. It had been the bridge between her dreams and reality. Without it, she would not have been ready when fate called her forward. She whispered to it sometimes, "You gave me courage," as though it were an old friend. The reflection of her journey grew into something larger than herself. People who heard her story were reminded that dignity lies not in wealth or fame but in character. They remembered how arrogance can crumble in an instant and how kindness, humility, and courage can leave a mark far greater than pride ever could. Clara's story became a quiet legend, told not in newspapers but in conversations, a reminder that greatness can come from the most unexpected places. And Clara herself carried one final truth. She knew life would not always be easy. She knew there would be more struggles, more nights of doubt, more battles against fear. But she also knew that she would never again allow herself to be silenced. She had discovered her voice, and once the world had heard it, she would not hide it again. So when Clara looked back on that night, she did not remember the spilled champagne or the cruel laughter with bitterness. She remembered the piano the moment she dared to sit, the music that rose from her soul and filled the hall. She remembered the applause that told her she was not invisible, not forgotten, not small. She was a musician, a dreamer, a fighter. She was Clara, the girl who turned humiliation into triumph, the waitress who became a pianist, the silent shadow who had finally stepped into the light.